A direct quote from Times executive editor Bakay: "We built our newsroom to cover one story, Russia collusion, and we did it truly well," Bakay said. "Now we have to regroup and shift resources and emphasize to take on a different story." Bakay adds, "We've got to change. The Times must write more deeply about the country, race, and other divisions." The Times staff agreed with Bakay on the shift toward racism-centric reporting. One Times staffer said racism and white supremacy is a foundation of America.
After Donald Trump BTFO'd the left in the 2016 presidential election, the mainstream left pursued this policy of trying to argue that Trump stole the election with assistance from Russia. By doing this, the mainstream left put all of their eggs in one basket, and that basket was being held by none other than Robert Mueller. Of course, the Robert Mueller investigation ended up in complete failure for the mainstream left. The investigation failed to uncover even a single piece of evidence that could successfully be used to prosecute President Donald Trump. We finally reached the point where the mainstream left is acknowledging their defeat. They now understand that if they want to get Trump thrown out of office, they're going to have to pursue a different strategy. Enter Project 1619. This is the New York Times' new project in order to take down President Trump. Recognizing the fact that Donald Trump is a nationalist, that he constantly makes appeals to the greatness of the United States, the New York Times has come up with a plan to rewrite the history of this country and make it out to be one that was entirely based off of racism and slavery. Now, before I go any further, I completely agree that slavery and racism played a role in the history of the United States. However, I see what the New York Times is trying to do here, and I know that they're going to approach this subject in a way that's unfair and dishonest. So I wanted to make this video and share my thoughts on the role of slavery in the history of the United States. Around the time of 1619, Europe and Africa were very different places. Europe became so much more technologically advanced than Africa in light of the fact that it had access to the world's greatest trade route. This trade route stretched all the way from Spain and Great Britain, across Europe, through the Middle East, through the nation of India and China, and it ended in the country of Japan. All the countries that existed on this trade route had similar climates, which means if they domesticated certain plants or animals, then those animals could be traded across the entire route. It's for this reason that both Europeans and people in China and Japan had access to horses and cows, ate many of the same crops, and both had access to paper and written languages. Africa did not have any of these things. For one, a giant desert separated Africa from Europe. In fact, Europeans were able to sail ships around the desert in order to trade with Africa far before they had technology that would allow them to actually cross the desert. Even when the Europeans started trading with the Africans, the climate of Africa was not compatible with European crops or animals. Any animals traded to Africans, such as cows or pigs, would just die of disease. European crops, which were able to grow in the Middle East and Asia, were not able to grow in Africa. Because Europe was connected to the Middle East, India, China, and the rest of Asia, it was able to discover new technologies quickly. These were technologies that Africa did not have access to when it first had contact with the Europeans. As a result of trade and technological advancement, Europe over time abolished the institution of slavery. In medieval Europe, there were people who were slaves. They were called serfs, but essentially what they were slaves. As Europe became more technologically advanced and wealthier, instead of paying its serfs with food and shelter, they were eventually paid with currency. What about Africa? Well, the Africans were also an agricultural society. People think of African tribes, but in fact, most Africans lived in kingdoms that were ruled by kings or princes. The Africans had managed to domesticate their own crops that grew in tropical climates, things like bananas or sorghum. At the time Europeans began to have contact with Africans, African society was much like that of medieval Europe. You had African serfs who worked kind of like slaves in exchange for shelter and a small amount of food, while whatever prince they worked for lived a life of luxury. When Europeans began arriving in North America, they found all of this land that was capable of growing European crops. And the land was mostly empty, because something along the lines of 90% of the Native Americans were wiped out from diseases carried by Spanish explorers. There was all this land available that could be put to good use making money growing crops. However, in order to use that land, there was a need for workers. During the beginning days of the colonization of America, people were brought in from both Europe and Africa as indentured servants. The workers that came from Africa had been slaves. They were supposed to be slaves for their entire lives. However, in Europe, slavery had been abolished. Serfdom had been abolished. So the Europeans who brought the Africans over to North America couldn't just treat them as slaves, so instead they treated them as indentured servants, the same as how the people who were taken from Europe to the United States were treated. This means that after a certain number of years, the African workers could earn their freedom. This is something that never would have been available to them had they remained in Africa. Because it took longer to pick up the African workers and then shuttle them across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, they would typically be indentured for a longer period of time to pay the costs that were incurred in picking them up and bringing them to North America. Eventually, this period of time in which they were indentured became so much longer than that of Europeans that they were effectively like slaves. And over time, as this went on and on, people began to think of the Africans being brought over across the Atlantic not as indentured servants, but as slaves. Now, I brought up earlier that the black people brought across the Atlantic would have been slaves if they had remained in Africa. And while that's true, I also want to point out that the slavery that existed in the United States was a lot more cruel than the slavery that would have existed in Africa. African lords and princes likely treated their slaves pretty poorly, but at the same time, their slaves looked like them. They grew up in the same society. It would have been a lot harder for them to dehumanize their slaves to the degree that white slave owners in North America did. Now, one thing that I think is very important to point out, and is something that you definitely won't hear in any article that's a part of Project 1619, is that the United States did not invent this institution of slavery based on race that existed in this country. Slavery was introduced to North America when the United States was part of the British Empire. You notice that in Great Britain, they did not bring in a lot of black people to work as slaves. This is something that they subjected the United States to, that they never would have done in their own country. People forget that the United States was colonized by Britain. That means that Great Britain did things in the United States that would have been morally unacceptable in its own country. The idea that the founding fathers liked and supported the institution of slavery is absolutely ridiculous. Most of the founding fathers viewed slavery for what it was, a terrible thing that the nation of Great Britain subjected the United States to in light of the fact that it was a lower colony, something that could only be done in a colony where people were not treated like equal citizens. George Washington, for example, owned slaves but treated them extremely well. And upon his death, not only did he free all of his slaves, but he agreed to pay for a college education for all of their children. Does that sound like something a deeply racist person would do? Does that sound like something that someone who was a proponent of slavery would be interested in doing? So why did the founding fathers tolerate slavery in the United States after the founding? Well, there were a couple good reasons. First of all, at least around the time of the founding, slavery was a terrible way to conduct agriculture, and one that they thought would inevitably fail. You see, when you enslave a bunch of people and don't pay them, just force them to work, they do basically the bare minimum amount of work to avoid getting in trouble. This is the same problem with communism and collective farming. If a worker isn't benefiting at all from the work that they do, then the incentive is for them to do as little work as possible. What this meant was agricultural yields from farms ran by slaves were far lower than those of farms run by families who had an economic stake in the success of the farms. The United States during this time was having an unprecedented population boom. It seemed very likely that all of these slave-run farms would quickly be replaced with family-owned farms, that the institution of slavery could just be abolished, that over time the institution of slavery would be naturally abolished. So why were the founding fathers wrong? Why did slavery continue for so much longer in the United States, even though it was so much less effective than family farming? The reason for this is the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin greatly boosted the efficiency of plantation-style farms worked by slaves. If the cotton gin had not been invented, it's actually entirely plausible that slavery would have ended on its own in the United States. Of course, the founding fathers would have never been able to predict the invention of this particular piece of technology. The other reason the founding fathers didn't want to abolish slavery during the founding was the fact that they had just fought a brutal war with Great Britain. If they lost the support of the South, if the South wanted to rejoin the British Empire, it could completely destroy the country of the United States. The United States could end up once again subject to the colonial authority of Great Britain. This could have made the problem of slavery even worse. After all, it was Great Britain that created this institution in the United States, something that Great Britain never would have tolerated in its own country. Another myth that I wanted to insert here, because I'm sure you're going to hear it a lot during this Project 1619, is that the evil racist founders hated black people so much that in the Constitution, they indicated that a black person counted as only 3/5 of a person. Of course, this is a complete lie. When the United States was founded, living in its territory were both free black citizens and black slaves. The 3/5 provision of the Constitution applied only to black slaves. Free black citizens were always considered a whole person according to the U.S. Constitution. Free blacks were never considered by the United States government to be only 3/5 of a person. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in this video is the view that slavery was the greatest injustice in the history of the United States. While I agree that the slavery that existed in the southeast part of the United States was pretty horrible and is definitely one of the worst parts of our country's history, I don't think that it's the worst. As I talked about earlier, the origins of race-based slavery in the United States originated from the fact that the United States was a colony of Great Britain. Well, the United States ended up doing the same thing during the Spanish-American War, when it took over all of the territories of Spain, including Puerto Rico, various Pacific islands, including Guam, American Samoa, and the largest piece of territory, the Philippines. Around the time immediately prior to World War II, there were in fact more Filipinos living in the United States than there were black people. And Americans treated Filipino people in the Philippines far worse than they treated black people in the interior of the United States. Most Americans think that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in America, but that's simply not true. Slavery was permitted to go on in the Philippines for years. In fact, there were likely still people living as slaves in the Philippines when it was made independent by the United States after World War II. When Philippines was a colony of the United States, Filipino people were treated as second-class citizens in their own country. The United States ruled the country by appointing some sort of regional governor who basically ruled over the country as some sort of dictator. All of the clubs and buildings built in the Philippines by the United States when it was a colony had separate white-only entrances from Filipinos. Segregation and racism were common elements in the Philippines while it was a U.S. colony. The United States also failed to protect the Philippines when it was invaded by Japan in World War II. The country lived under a brutal Japanese occupation that included a mass rape of Filipino women. When U.S. troops finally liberated the Philippines and made contact with the Filipino people, many of the U.S. soldiers were shocked to learn that Filipino people could speak fluent English. The average U.S. soldier had no idea that the Filipinos were Americans. They lived in the United States. But no one ever talks about this. Certainly not the globalist New York Times. No, they want you to only focus on slavery in the Southeast. They want to distract you from the really terrible part of United States history. The part that explains not just the slavery of blacks in the Southeast, but the exploitation of the Philippines and other people during U.S. history. And that is, of course, globalism and imperialism. So don't listen to the lies of the New York Times. If you like this video, then please subscribe to this channel. Thank you.